Welcome to yet another Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group extravaganza, a wonderful event today with some wonderful guests we're going to have on hand. For those that aren't familiar with SDIG, that is the Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. In a nutshell, what we are is a global forum for dialogue. It is our heartfelt belief that engagement and dialogue leads to greater awareness, and greater awareness leads to change. And that's what we're all about. We bring together people, great, wonderful individuals with experience, with knowledge, with ideas, and we share these things hoping that we all get a spark from this, and we all learn something we didn't know before, and we all raise our own consciousness, and in turn that consciousness identifies ways that we see to change ourselves and eventually to change the world. So that's what we're here to do. Dr. Joseph Nawali is with us. He is our founder, chief, and leader, and all-time saint, maybe, if you will. Dr. Joe, would you like to say something before we get started?
Well, thank you so much. What can I say? David always does a phenomenal job in getting us focused on what it is that we are dealing with. David, I really appreciate the way you synthesize this. It's about communication. The more I look at things, the more I read things, sometimes I get really depressed. For instance, what is happening in Atlanta, how people went and killed someone and thought they were going to get away with it. I don't know what society we are in. How in the world could those type of things happen? And it only takes people like all of you who understand life, who understand the importance of communication, sharing ideas, exploring all those views, and remaining true to what we are. So I very much appreciate your work and all your work, and we look forward to doing more of this in order to find a better world. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm very excited about this because we're kind of changing up the format a little bit. Typically, what we do at SDIG, we bring in a panel of experts, not that the women today are experts, they most certainly are, but we're not approaching it more like a educational panel as much as we would just want to have a conversation this afternoon on a very important topic to us all. We do know that this is Mental Health Awareness Month, and that is why we're speaking here today. But I want to say something before I introduce these two women. I think this is really relevant not only for that reason, because it is Mental Health Awareness Month, but there's been a lot of talk about frontline workers. And let me tell you, if there is anybody on the front line of mental health issues or disabilities, it is these two guests we have with us today. You can look at them as frontline workers in this battle, in this issue. So it gives me really great pleasure to introduce to you our very own Tabitha Pope. Tabitha is the Director of Disability Services at Southern Nazarene University in Bethany, Oklahoma. Welcome, Tabitha. Nice to have you.
Thank you.
And then our other very esteemed guest is Barbara Lee Van Horsen from Grand Haven, Michigan. She is, I'm going to say director, but she's also, if you look at her page, it says Asperi Mentor, and I'll let her address that title as well. But Barb is the director of the Momentum Center for Social Engagement in Grand Haven, Michigan. Many of you probably don't know this establishment yet, and it's a vision of Barb's that came to be reality, but it just has such great outreach in the community, and one of those outreaches is in several areas of mental health. And of course, I don't want to steal Barb's thunder, but we'll get to that. And so, to me, it's very timely, not only in Mental Health Awareness Month, but in the fact that these people are on the front lines, and we appreciate so much these days those that put themselves forward in any venture to take the lead and to be advocates, be champions, be supporters of people, and in this case, supportive of people perhaps that have mental health issues. So rather than David sit here and talk a long time, I don't want to steal the thunder, so I'm going to introduce Tabitha and let Tabitha take it from here, and we're going to have a conversation today on mental health. Thank you, Tabitha.
you, David. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm excited to be here, and thank you, Barb. We're going to know each other. We're going to have our first chat, just like with you all. So, are you ready, Barb?
So.
No? Well, we're going to go for it anyway. So today we wanted to make a distinction between mental impairments, mental illness, in comparison to disability, mainly physical disabilities, I think. But then we're going to really, this conversation is going to enlighten people and I think bring a new understanding to disability. So let's get started. I wanted to say that for the sake of the audience, if you would, Barb, would you define mental health versus mental disabilities? Or is there a difference?
Well, yeah, there are differences. There's a lot of nuances here. First of all, there's developmental disabilities, which can be physical or intellectual or both. To have an intellectual disability, you need to have an IQ of 70 or below and have difficulty with daily functioning. Down syndrome is probably the most recognized example of a developmental disability with an intellectual disability. With mental illness, it's not the same as an intellectual disability. Mental health affects mood, and it can affect thought processing, it can affect behavior, and it can manifest itself at any point in the life cycle. So mental illness doesn't normally directly affect cognitive ability, but it can. And when both of those things exist together, we call it a dual diagnosis. And I have an example. In my own family, I have a niece who has Down syndrome. I have a son who has schizophrenia, and his breaks have created a cognitive disability for him as well. So he has a dual diagnosis now that came out of the mental illness. The other distinction that I think is important to make is that I get really concerned when the conversation gets to be around acts of violence in the community and how quickly people label that as a result of a mental illness. And I think it's important that we distinguish between mental illness and mental health issues. For most mental illnesses, violence is not an aspect of mental illness. My son with schizophrenia, for instance, violence is not even one of the symptoms of schizophrenia normally. And so I think we have a real road ahead of us to educate the public around that, while also recognizing that we do have people that are struggling with mental health issues, and that those include things like hatred and bigotry. And so we need to, there's a lot of parsing out to do.
Mm-hmm. I love how you said that. There's a beautiful distinction. And I thank you for sharing about your son, because my mother had bipolar and schizophrenic tendencies. So I've grown up with that and I understand that fully. And you're absolutely right. There is a distinction between like depression and anxiety versus the mental illnesses, and that they don't necessarily have a component of aggression and maladaptive behavior in society. So I think that the media really plays on that, and it does, we'll be talking about this, but it really plays into how society includes or excludes individuals from engaging and being their best selves and contributing. So I appreciate that. And that's my hope for this conversation, is to bring awareness that there's a lot of positives there. Everybody can participate in society, and it's not something to be necessarily afraid of. So great job. Thank you for sharing. Let's see, the next question I wanted to address was the difference between stigma of mental health and mental disability and physical disabilities. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is really where I primarily focus. If I can just share a little bit about the Momentum Center. We are a grassroots movement to create a stigma-free community. And we do that in a couple of different ways. We host community conversations, so not unlike what we're doing right now. We have Inspire events that focus on topics of social justice and human rights. And we also have town hall meetings on various aspects of mental illness. We actually have one, we're going to do our first virtual town hall on Monday night where we address mental illness and COVID-19. The other thing we do is operate the Momentum Center for Social Engagement, which is a social and recreational program for people with mental illness, addictions, and disabilities. So we provide kind of that complementary service to clinical and therapeutics. Recognizing you can't, even if you are in therapy, you can do that 40 hours a week, right? There are only so many hours you can spend in therapy. There's a whole lot of other hours in the day. So we offer that social and recreational piece for people, particularly who are at risk of isolation. One of the things that's really unique about that is that we do blend populations that are typically separated, those with developmental disabilities and those with mental illness. We bring all of those people together. And we have an aspect of the center, which is a fair trade store and coffee shop, which is open to the public, as well as our members. So the whole idea is that we provide a place of social integration rather than unintentionally creating more isolation for people by kind of defining a place for a certain part of the population to congregate. Recognizing that we're all in this together. To be a member, it costs $1 a year, and you don't need a clinical diagnosis, you don't need a referral, you can just be going through a hard time. And again, trying to break down the stigma that keeps people from seeking help. I mentioned the difference between the way that the media approaches those mass killings, because it's so terrifying that we would create more obstruction to people getting help. And when we stigmatize people who are already at risk, we just make that even more likely that they're going to not get the assistance they need. 1 in 4 people will experience mental illness during their lifetime, and 60% of those people will never seek any treatment at all. And the major reason for that is stigma. In fact, 58% of people with mental illness say that the stigma is more difficult to handle and to deal with than the mental illness itself. So there's a lot of work to do. I think with disabilities, and I mentioned I have a niece with Down syndrome, there's still a whole lot of work we need to do in the disability community too. There's still stigma, there's still errant expectations there. But I find that usually in the world of developmental disabilities, there are advocates that are helping their loved ones get resources. With mental illness, there's very often been a disconnect from those people that would typically be the advocates. The illness itself has disrupted those relationships. And so it is the people who are in most need and least able to advocate for themselves that often don't have advocates to help them. So right now in our culture, if you have a mental illness and you don't have a strong advocate, you're likely to end up homeless or in jail or dead. And those are pretty grim outcomes. And again, until we address the stigma, not only does that keep people from seeking help, it keeps people from even self-identifying, from having that self-awareness. And it also creates, it changes the priorities in our system in terms of where funding goes and who gets treatment.
You did a beautiful job of explaining all of that. Now, there's a lot to be said. So now I'm going to be talking like if you were in my office, because a lot of things popped up in my head about what you said. I have students, so I work with college students with disabilities. And Gen Z right now is in America is really the one generation with anxiety in the heavens and depression out of control. They don't know how to deal with life experiences right now. So that's exasperating. COVID-19 around the world exasperates things. And then when we talk about, so I'm talking about disability and mental illness, but when we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we think about the globe, when we think about that first layer in Maslow down with safety, basic needs being met, the basic needs, food, shelter, right? And access to resources like you were talking about. When those basic needs aren't met, that causes stress. Stress is mental health issues. And then there's the safety component. And so I want the audience to really understand mental illness in that capacity, how it's everywhere. I think someone brought up a question like, you know, who does this affect? It affects children, it affects old people, young people, adults, it affects people all over the world, everywhere. So what are your thoughts on that? Are you?
You know, I often, when I'm speaking to organizations and individuals, I'll talk about the fact that 1 in 4 people will struggle with significant mental illness during their lifetime, which means 3 out of 4 of us have a loved one who will experience significant mental illness. It really is affecting every one of us in one way or another. And I do think we're making inroads. We're starting to have these conversations, for instance, and that's crucial. It's really vital. But there's so much more work we have to do.
I know. It's disheartening to have talked to like my students with depression and anxiety. They don't want to disclose, and it's because they're afraid that they'll be treated different because they have been treated different, right? They'll say, oh, in America, we'll say, suck it up, buttercup. You know, I mean, pull up your bootstraps. Let's get going. You know, you don't have to be sad. The sun is shining today. You know, it's a beautiful day. Get over it. And so we impose all these messages on people who have a chemical imbalance, and it's a real thing, right? And there's real causes to it, but society doesn't seem to accept it.
We do. We continue to.
I'm
Sure.
sorry, just because this is very, question came in that's very germane to the point you were just making when you referenced that it spans multiple age groups. The other question was, in terms of depression specifically, how does it manifest itself differently across these age groups or across gender perhaps, or have you seen it manifest differently depending on the culture that a person is raised in? So the differences in depression from one group to another. Can you talk about that? Have you seen these type of differences across the generations or genders?
What we tend to see in our community anyway is that it really, you know, it's not discriminatory, right? Mental illness doesn't discriminate. So but I do think that the stigmas can be different in different communities. I think, you know, women tend to, even with personal health care, tend to reach out to see their doctor before men go to see their doctor. I think there's some of those cultural expectations about, you know, that influence something broader than the mental health question. I know, Tabitha, if you would agree with that, but I really think it's more, the response to mental illness is more culturally based than whether you have mental illness.
Here's what I wrote. I wrote, you cannot tease physical disability from mental impairments. A diagnosis causes tremendous stress. In addition, medical research estimates as much as 90% of illness and disease is stress-related. Stress can interfere with physical functioning and bodily processes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. Couple that with war, poverty, age, and that's all stress. I feel stressed, but that is everywhere, you know, it's everywhere and it affects everyone. So we have this combined element of mental impairment plus disease, physical impairment, and it doesn't like you said, it doesn't, it affects everyone. It's the human condition, it's the human experience. And it's all our, when we talk about stigma, I think it affects all of us. So it should be something that's on our plate, on our priority list to be doing something. How do we relate to people with mental impairments? How do we relate to people with Down syndrome? Do we exclude them? Do we include them? Are we doing it intentionally? And I would say that we're not doing it effectively.
Yeah, I would agree. And I do think we do tend to blame people with mental illness for their mental illness. You were giving the examples, you know, suck it up, get over it, it's nice out, what have you got to complain about? We blame people for not being able to get out of their situation more so than, you know, we don't blame people for their physical illness. We don't blame people for their developmental disabilities typically. And the mental illness is that hidden disability usually. So we don't know what people are struggling with. And that means we don't know that we're not alone in our struggles. Because again, we create these barriers for talking about it. I think one of the pieces of data in recent years that's been really, really helpful for me is understanding ACEs and the effect of adverse childhood experiences. The idea that, you know, the more adverse childhood experiences we have, the more likely we are to develop both physical and emotional issues later in life around those things that we might not even think about. So we might think, yeah, that could affect us emotionally, but we don't necessarily think about how that could affect our blood pressure, our diabetes, cancer, those kind of things. And what was really striking to me about it, I think the real learning point for me was recognizing that in our community, we have more people with 4 or more ACEs than would be expected, because I live in, like, supposedly one of the healthiest communities in Michigan, one of the healthiest counties. And I'm one of those people with 4 ACEs. And what I recognized was looking at the fact that about half of our population has 0 ACEs. And recognizing that if you have had no adverse childhood experience, how much more difficult it is for you to understand what it means to not be able to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, because you don't have bootstraps.
Exactly.
And it's given me more, I think, empathy and compassion toward how do we continue the dialogue to help people who really don't understand to be able to start grasping that difference.
Yes, I was talking to a student of mine yesterday, and she has CP. And we were talking about being together today, and she was very adamant about that they're linked. You know, the physical diagnosis causes the stress, and it's very linked. And I said, well, what do you think can help with that? Because she wants to go and be a counselor. And she said, we have to connect people's feelings, right? So somebody who doesn't have any ACEs, we need to understand something about them, like, when have you felt anxious? When did you feel not in control? When did you feel that you were very sad, that it was controlling your life, right? And that you weren't in control. Then connect that to something a person with CP might feel. And then that would create that empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We need to take the time to do that. And again, just for my own learning, to be a little less quick to judge the people who are judging other people.
Right. Yeah. And you know what's really funny, Barb, is that I work with faculty all the time, and they'll say, I am helping your students. I am doing everything I can to help them. And I'm like, I'm not faculty. I don't have a classroom. Those are your students, you know, that's your job. But it's always this other, right? Isn't it? It's so strange to me how people instantly, once I send a piece of paper that says they get accommodations under the American Disabilities Act, they immediately categorize them as less valuable, the other, something to be fixed. It's called the medical model. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah.
Disability models, there's many of them, but the prominent one is the medical model, which is, oh, we can fix you, or you need to go fix you.
Yes. Well, and so one of the things that I think we need to promote is the idea of neurodiversity. And the fact that we really are all wired differently. We process things differently. We react to stress differently. And just because somebody processes things and understands differently than I do doesn't mean I need to change them. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. And some, even, you know, I spoke of my son and his schizophrenia. He's very stable now. We have him on the right medication. He's stable. He's doing well. He still interacts with a world in which I don't interact with. And it's very real for him. And I, as long as he's healthy and it's safe and it's not a scary place, there's no reason that he shouldn't be able to do that. As long as he's functional and carrying on. So, you know, finding that space where we can allow differences without needing to make people conform to an idea, a ridiculous idea of normal, right?
Well, and you know, while I was researching, I was kind of thinking, how can you get those without ACEs who have had this beautiful life to connect? And one of the things is, if you can give me 5 minutes with a person who says, oh, I've never known anyone with disability. I don't have disability. I'm like, give me 5 minutes. 5 minutes with you, and I bet we will. It's just an understanding of the definition and what disability is. And that's interesting. Then the second thing I wanted to talk to you about was just what you were talking about, was this, if we could, how do I say it? You don't see people in leadership who say, I have bipolar disorder. I struggle getting out of the bed 3 weeks out of the year. I could care less about seeing tomorrow. You know, you have very few. You're starting to see some Hollywood stars, and you're starting to see it on television these days, and that's really good. I think that's going to help, because what I'm trying to say is people will relate when they see people in leadership positions, when they start feeling like they have a safe place to disclose in the workplace and in their community. And then once we go, oh, Barb has that. She's my friend, right? Now it's not scary. Are you kind of feeling that? Do you think that I'm kind of on the right track? And
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's a big part, again, of what we do at the center with Just Goods, where people intermix. It's that idea that it isn't about us and them, that we're all in this, that we all have, you know, our times and our difficulties. We it was really interesting. We were working when we were very first started, and I had my first board, and we were applying for some money. And one of the requirements was that we had to report the percentage of people on the board who had mental illness. And, you know, we were new, and I'm like, I knew about a couple of individuals and their struggles because they shared that with me. But I'm saying, so we need to report this, and there's like silence. and then I sent an email and said, so I actually need to know this so that, you know, I can report it. And one person sent an email just to me and said, you know, I don't really normally share this, but I've been on antidepressants for several years. And I thanked her. And then somebody else emailed privately. And then somebody emailed the whole group and said, you know, I don't normally share this, but this is my struggle. And that broke the bottleneck. And by the time we were done, everybody on the board had shared, you know, their immediate struggle or their struggle of an immediate loved one. And again, and it is breaking that down. We had our luncheon last year and made a point, my treasurer, who's an attorney, was the host of the event. the MC. And she got up and talked about her background as an attorney, and now she is teaching autistic kids and all the wonderful things that she's doing. And then at the second break, she said, and what I didn't tell you is that I've been struggling with severe depression and suicidal ideation. And it changes the whole dynamic when the people we least expect, right? Because we still have those stereotypes and those expectations are willing to kind of out themselves as being part of this vast population, which then gives courage to people to say, I'm not alone. I am professional and I struggle too. Which goes back to the, how does our culture treat people who do come forward with these issues? Because there isn't parity in that treatment.
So I'm going to jump off what you just said. We talked about the medical model needing to fix people, and then there's the charity model, which is, it's so sad that the Lord or whomever, the divine or karma, or you did something wrong has caused this in your life, right? And it could reflect poorly on your family. So I was talking to a friend in India, or from India, and that, in that culture, mental illness, disability, that's a bad thing, so is there disclosure? Oh no, they're not going to have that. I have students from the Middle East who come in, and they could have a hearing impairment, right? So this is getting in the way of their learning, and that will affect their family. Right? So in America, we want to curb that. We want to make sure you're accommodated. But I can honestly have a student sit there and make a decision not to go through the process to get accommodations because they don't want their family to know. They don't want to bring shame on their family. And they're really having a tense conflict within themselves, spiritually, emotionally, on what are the repercussions, what are the risks. So for our audience, what are your thoughts? Like, what can they do? Like, how does that begin to change in those cultures that really don't agree with talking about disability and helping?
Well, yeah, I think I do a lot of, I do cultural immersion experiences. And so I always am real sensitive about wanting to recognize that it's not my place to change somebody else's culture, but to enter into these dialogues, to be able to share, my thoughts and feelings and experiences, and to be willing to listen to the honest experiences of others. And so I think, as those students are moving through our systems, we need to be creating the places where we can have that conversation and equip them to be able to be self-advocates, to be able to permit and recognize that they will have more influence talking to their families and having an influence in the culture than we ever could if we, and it's not my place to do that. But I think that the people with whom I interact, if I can share my experience and welcome them and offer the kind of resources and help and assistance, and that knowledge that you're not alone, that we are all working through these things, that's the starting point. It's these conversations.
Hey Barb, could you contrast or compare something with me a second? I know that in your past you've done a lot with the LGBTQ community, and I do some work in that as well. But within that, a lot of the discussion is framed around either you coming out as an LGBTQ person, or you have allies that support you. So maybe framing mental health, and how does a person with mental health come out, or how do allies of those with mental health advocate for them?
Yeah, I think that's an appropriate comparison in some model, in some ways. I don't want to I don't want to disrespect the very real challenge of the LGBTQ community that has experienced profound violence because of their orientation or their identity. And so I don't want to minimize that in any way. But I do think there is, and I use the expression myself of coming out, that place where I now feel comfortable sharing my identity as somebody who has a mental illness or has a loved one with a mental illness, does have some parallels. There is a risk that's taken because there is this view, you know, people see us through their own lens, and when we give them more information, it can change who they thought we were, which can change the interaction, can change the relationship. And so I think at best, we're communicating with people that we care about their authentic self and not who we have imagined them to be. And that we practice that we practice understanding that who I know you to be is just my expectation of who you are. It's not necessarily who you really are. And until I'm really spending time immersed in that, in your experience, I don't know who that is. And so we need to really genuinely value each other. And I think it starts with valuing ourselves. You know, it's finding that place of self-acceptance and self-worth that, and self-empathy and self-compassion that really drives us to be able to express that kind of empathy and compassion for others. And when we do that, we really almost can't help but become advocates. And it's starting to advocating can be as simple as listening for the language people are using and being willing to say, hey, could you please not use the word schizophrenic that way? Because it's painful, it's hurtful. Or the other, you know, all of the, you know, the words that we associate with mental illness, you know, and the words we throw around so easily about being crazy and other kinds of language. Just like the GLBT community, if we start watching how we speak, that really becomes kind of, you know, the trigger in thinking through our own gut reactions, our own kind of reptilian brain, and being able to step back and be thoughtful and intentional in our words and in our interactions.
Thank you.
Can I jump on? Barb, I was thinking is what the world needs, in my opinion, are two things that will help us in this destigmatizing mental illness would be the fact that it says here, by 2020, mental and substance use disorders will surpass all physical diseases as the major cause of disability. It will cost the globe economy an estimated $1 trillion each year in lost productivity. So instead of us, I mean, yes, having our little conversations is essential, and that's beautiful, especially when we want to create places of safety in the environment. But also taking that to the next level, to the CEOs, to the leaders, because that we're talking money here. We're talking about a real need. And if we're losing productivity, that hits our pocketbook and their pocketbook. So I think that's really important when we talk about safe places. We're talking safe places in the workplace and safe places in our communities as well. I think that the COVID-19, because it stopped us, has made us, it has given us a platform to reflect on new things we can do and welcoming spaces. Can you talk to me about a welcome space in a community, what that looks like, and a welcome space in the workplace?
So I agree that making the financial argument it can create inroads where just making the emotional argument maybe doesn't. So when you start tying, especially in our culture, if you start tying things to money, you can get people's attention. And I do think you can easily make the case and justify things like employee assistance programs, and that's kind of a easy place to start in terms of creating, safe culture in employment atmospheres. That if we at least start with making sure that there's employee assistance programs available. And I think the more we communicate that there are options, the more, again, we normalize the conversation and the experience. I truly believe that the number of people who take advantage of programs is not an indicator of how many people benefit from them. I believe that people just knowing there are programs available is a great benefit, whether they ever use them or not. So the more we let people know what is available in the community, and in doing those surveys and understanding, how do you access help? How do you communicate that so people know how to access it within the larger community, within your employment setting? Do the canvas, do the survey, publish the results, make sure people know, and then look for the gaps. And then create those relationships with organizations and individuals that can help fill those gaps.
Right. And okay, so did we hit both of them? We talked about in the workplace, the safe environment, so the employment assistance programs. And I've seen a lot of trends now on creating safe places and teaching people that it's okay to talk about being sad. It's okay to having mental health day. Oh my goodness, did you hear about the high school students, I think in Oregon, who created mental health days instead of just sick days? Did you hear about that?
I did not hear about that.
So it's trending. I think it has to do with Gen Z pushing for inclusion, including all people, and mental impairments too need to be included in that. So that was a good thing. But the community, what are we just talking nonprofits? Are we talking churches?
I think as with most things, the nonprofits are kind of in the place to really promote that, to reach out to organizations and offer that kind of training, but that it needs to kind of become embedded. Just like, again, we need to start treating mental health the way we do physical health. We need to start talking to each other about how we're doing and what we do to get by, and make that part of the regular conversation. But I do think, sadly, you're right. I think more companies, more organizations are recognizing the need to deal with their employees' mental health. I think sadly it's taken tragedy for that to happen. In many of those instances, it's because employers have seen their workers and their lives. And that has been the wake-up call that, this isn't just, this is within our shop. This is affecting us individually. Or they've had experiences with family members. I mean, our suicide rates are up in pretty much every demographic. And so that is helping to normalize it. It's tragic that it has had to come to that, but it is becoming kind of the common experience that everybody knows somebody who has chosen to end their life. And we as a community, as a nation, and as individuals have a role and responsibility in trying to create more health for people in our immediate surroundings.
Right.
Hey, Barb, have you seen an uptick in your work, the need for your services since the pandemic hit?
Yeah, it's been, yes. When it first hit, we were busy moving from one platform to another, so we can't congregate together. So we went to a virtual platform, and we're live streaming exercise and meditation, and we have groups, and now we've launched our virtual support groups, and now our first virtual town hall meeting. But I would say in the last couple of weeks is when people are really starting to de-escalate. Here in Michigan, I think we're entering our 8th week of stay at home. What we're finding is our members are starting to reach out to volunteers rather than their clinicians. And so we're doing some training around appropriate boundaries and appropriate resources to make sure we're getting people where they need to go. At the same time, the places who are clinical and therapeutic are also seeing a big uptake. And I think we have now had 5 suicides in the course of 9 days in our county. I know there's an article on a 17-year-old high school student today in the paper that the family is wanting to share that to make people aware. Isolation is a big deal. And for us, of course, the whole reason we exist is to serve people who are at risk of isolation. So when we did have to shut the doors, it was a huge gut punch. And so we've worked really hard again to try to stay connected. We're bringing care kits to people who don't have access to the internet. But that's a reality too. There's a lot of people who aren't connected by technology. There are a lot of people who don't have phones. And how do we continue to reach out to those folks? The mental illness around COVID is very real, and it includes, the whole gamut. Worrying about getting sick, worried about loved ones getting sick, the isolation and loneliness, the issue of the schools being closed, and the abuse that's taking place in homes and isn't being seen, so it's not being reported. There's the economic crisis for individuals, as well as worrying about the economy in general, and the whole unknown. I mean, the big idea that none of us, can predict exactly when we'll be at what stage when. And I think, everybody wants those answers, and there's not anybody with the crystal ball that's just withholding them from us, right? Nobody likes to live in uncertainty. And if you already are struggling with mental illness, with anxiety, with depression, it can be devastating. Now, I will say we have some members who have significant social anxiety who are actually doing pretty well right now. They're engaging in the technical gatherings in a way that they just couldn't bring themselves to do physically. And to not be considered abnormal because you want to be on your own has been helpful. Again, the whole idea of neurodiversity, right? We all operate differently. There are introverts that are loving this stuff. But in general, the longer it goes, the more we're going to see that mental health crisis increase. And it's long-standing. That's not going away when stay-at-home ends. And I've heard numerous places talk about that the mental health toll will be the longest in this whole pandemic.
I was thinking about third world countries and the burden of a family unit, whether it's a physical disability or a mental disability of a family member, the burden on the family members that have to care, right? So there is barrier to inclusion within the community, right? They're labeled and they're already pushed back so that the family is not going to engage as somebody who doesn't have disability in their family. Then there's the burden of care within the home unit, and then the support demands. So because of COVID-19, they can't go and get help resources. Then there is that component, and you kind of talked about abuse, right? So if you have a mental impairment, I don't know how many, if you've never had a family member with mental impairment, they can be illogical, they can be unreasonable, they can be difficult, they can be behavior problems, their lack of self-care can be a problem, the fact that they're not caring for you, the fact that they're not getting up and contributing, all of that causes a lot of tension in the family. And so now it's not just the one individual who's been diagnosed with mental illness, it's affecting the family. And that's a burden. And it's really hard to have to care for that individual as well as to engage and act like everything's normal. All of that, I'm creating a picture, I hope, of how hard it is and how much it's going to continue growing, just like you were saying. It's not going to go away. There's not an easy cure for that. It causes stress, and if they don't have the resources, counselors in third world countries, who do they have? And then religious beliefs, right? So then
Yep.
if you're absolutely silenced, tragic. It's tragic. I don't know I wish I knew in the countries that they can't disclose disability, where it's not safe to disclose, I don't know how they handle it. I think that they just handle it within the home. I did read a research article the other day from Africa, and the stigma was so bad, and the family member with the impairment was so bad that the family would just kind of lock them in a room or lock them away so they were away from the rest of the family so they could function, and they would just push food in there. I don't know. I just wanted to bring that to our awareness that it's not so easy as if you were in America or in Europe.
It isn't. I do want to draw a distinction though, because there are different, different countries within Africa address it differently. So I wouldn't want to say all of Africa. But yeah, those cultural differences are true, and they are. I mean, people die because of those beliefs. The same is true in our country though too. There is, just the ethos of a particular family. The fact that we don't talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Those barriers do exist here, but yes, they are certainly emphasized. And when you have a whole country that wants to deny those kind of issues, then yeah, finding resources and support can be really impossible.
And it highlights the absolute need for people to engage and to help others, right? And not just focus on what's going on in their little world.
Yeah.
I think of servant leadership, I think.
Well, I think in addition to locational cultural differences, the same could be said about the perceptions in other aspects of culture as well. That could be the religious community that person is a member of, or the social economic community that person is a member of as well. So what other big factors do you see besides just the physical community you live in, other types of communities, whether that's social economic communities, religious communities, or those type of things, Barb?
Well, again, we've already mentioned that when it comes to mental illness, it crosses all of those barriers, all of those demographics. Nobody's accepted from that. Every demographic is impacted. Whether people have access to resources, is another question. And, when we have people, and again, we see this with the pandemic too, the people who are working the minimum wage jobs are somehow, the essential workers who are on the job and contracting illness, or they're the ones that have been let go. Was it just this morning that they were talking about the job numbers and the fact that unemployment is higher than ever, but it also appears that average wages have increased. And the reality is wages have not increased, but the people who make nothing are now not being counted. The only people that are still bringing in a paycheck are the people who are making a living wage. The fact that we have so many disparities to address in our country. And this is just really highlighting those disparities. So if you don't have resources, if you don't have financial resources, if you don't have things like transportation, then you have a really hard time accessing any available treatment that might be available.
Mm-hmm.
Barbara, if I may ask, I'm so intrigued by your comments, especially when you look at it as you have just expressed a little while ago, the intersectionalities of these issues, physical or mental, or in case, as you well pointed out, when you look at this unprecedented COVID-19, what it has exposed the issues of inequity so broadly, and is in plain sight. Unfortunately, there are still some nincompoops that would deny that those things exist.
That's a technical term, right? Nincompoop.
So I'm so amazed with the depth with which you are expressing these things, because sometimes we are like of our culture, our limited knowledge in almost every aspect of life. And yet we use that our narrow perspective to generalize. And that generalization doesn't even make a dent on magnitude of things we ought to do. So I'm so pleased with your presentation, your knowledge, and I urge you to continue that path, because these are people whose problems are never discussed. I was reading an article from Harvard Business News with someone who had worked in a company, and he happened to be a minority, and he was talking about the fact that people in the community, people he worked with, are like oblivious to what she has to go through every day, where she would be stopped. This is an executive vice president, I don't remember the particular title. She will come to work, somebody will take him and lock him up in somewhere and say, hey, change it, and tell the person that they hired a new person who will be coming, that he should make sure he greets that person well. But this vice president or high-placed individual was not even recognized when he came in. The person who was telling him this was looking at the mindset of who should be executive. Obviously, in his little mind, he didn't know that some of that magnitude will come. And that's why I think that it is very important that these discussions continue, because some people, really don't know. And some people think that they know. Maya Angelou said, when we know better, we do better. That means we draw from the new information in order to do better. If we don't know better, we continue to recycle, and we never move an inch. I'm taking too much of time, but I really want to thank you especially for your presentation.
Hey, Barb, thank you, Joseph, very much. Barb, do you have a specific, speaking of what Joseph was getting to, do you have a specific example or experience where someone's eyes have been open to the full broad context of what mental illness is about? Some experience, some speech you gave, or a sideline conversation where someone's eyes they finally got it?
I think more about the amount of times that I've spoken and then had somebody approach me privately afterward to say, hey, I haven't told anybody this, but this is my struggle. That's very common. Or being approached by email or Facebook or whatever afterward. And some of those, and I guess one of my examples, one of them that's most striking to me would be one of those people who, for a very long time, I was the one person that knew. And then at one of our events, she managed to stand up and say, hey, you guys don't know this about me, but I'm ready to share this. And that's, I think, the most powerful witness of being able to create safe places for people. And I think that's where the ahas come. It's not from, you know, here's my great speech. It's in relationship. It's in hearing people's story, and recognizing the parallels in our stories, and putting faces and names to these very real issues and concerns, that we're talking about people, not numbers and not statistics.
There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of shame when you have mental illness, or like I've had PTSD after my brain tumors. I didn't know where that tumor came from. It just traumatized me, and it changed my life, and I was left with the damage, right? And it wasn't really a problem up until the point that somebody commented on it, that I recognized that it was a problem to others. Then that bred shame. And so there's so much shame within individuals and then within the family members. And it takes a long time to reconcile those feelings and those conflicts, and to come to terms and have enough courage to come out. So what you said is beautiful. It's in those relationships, that safe place where you can find acceptance and find your worth again, and be able to stand up and say, you know what, this is the one life I've got, and I'm here, you know.
And this is only a small portion of what makes me me, right? This doesn't define me. This is just a piece of the beautiful complex that is me.
I think that since we are so global and so connected these days, and I also think because of the UN and their Sustainable Developmental Goals, 2 of their goals out of the 17 are directly connected to ending disability, ending poverty, ending food shortage, you know. So all of that talks about the resources we have that will help people, and there's a big picture now and everybody gets to see it. I think that's a beautiful thing for our world, to be able to start these conversations and have exponential growth. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, again, the more conversations that we can have, the better. It's about normalizing the conversation. It's about demystifying it. I think you mentioned fear earlier. It's removing, you know, the fear of the unknown, which is, you know, a human instinct. So how do we move forward and kind of take the veil away so that we can have these kind of honest exchanges, and that normalize and personalize. Shame is that is a result of stigma, right? You know, it's and now somehow I'm a bad person because of my experience. You know, we need to provide opportunities to demonstrate how that is not the case, where we really can celebrate, again, the uniqueness of each individual, look for creating health, you know, so that people can embrace all of the aspects of themselves that give them strength and comfort, and can find resources and assistance to address those things that bring, you know, pain and suffering, which is not the same as never hurting. And I think that's part of the dilemma that we've created in a culture that also seems to think we should never feel pain, that we need to find ways to experience our pain and to move through it, and to walk with people through their pain, not try to take it away from them. And then we can get into a whole nother conversation about addiction. But I think that part of a real honest assessment is also recognizing that we will all struggle, whether we have a diagnosable mental illness or not. Crap happens, and life doesn't go the way it was supposed to, and we hurt. And so we all need to be able to find resources to move through those hurts. And at the same time, not use those experiences to judge somebody else for not being able to move through that. And it's such a, I mean, there's such a delicate balance that we have to hold in all of this. It's like so many, all of the things that matter are not black and white, right? There's all the nuance, and we've got to bring the nuance into the conversation. There's no big categories that we just place everything into. It's all intersectionality, as Joseph was saying. It's all, we're complex human beings, and these are complex topics. And they require a complexity of approach.
Right. And I want to jump in. I definitely, I was talking to somebody, it's education, right? So it's not just in the workplace, it's not just in your family unit, but it's actually teaching parents to teach their children. It's actually changing or creating legislation that makes sure that curriculum is teaching inclusivity and teaching how to react to difference, right? Instead of just being scared, like, let's talk about that feeling of scared. What are you scared of, right? And then modeling, having people model, oh, I have a child with schizophrenia and I'm still here, I'm leading, I'm active in my community. It's not the end of the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're really talking about and asking people to do, but we don't have enough education teaching people how to have that conversation. I don't see that. Do you see that? And how could we make that happen more?
Well, I think that's a big reason why organizations like mine exist, and like David and Joseph's exist, is because we're recognizing that need to have the conversations that people aren't having, that are complex and nuanced, that aren't about taking sides. Like, in our culture, we've gotten really good at wanting to debate and argue everything. So just modeling what it is to have an adult conversation where we don't have to find, points of disagreement, that we can all kind of be working together toward, more awareness, more enlightenment, more direction, and encouraging, these kind of models throughout the country, and using the platforms that we do have, using Zoom and the internet and the different platforms to spread our message. I know you guys are working to spread these conversations. We're looking for other communities that would be interested in a momentum center. How do we share a model that works, where we're seeing statistically significant decreases in depression and anxiety and loneliness, increases in social connectedness. When things are working, finding the voices and the platforms to share them, to give them greater visibility on a national and an international front. It's, I think when we try to solve the whole problem, it gets really big, really fast, and we're more likely to not do anything, because I can't fix this, right? This conversation is not going to end it. It's about figuring out the one thing I can do, just the one thing, and then doing that one thing. Yeah. And I think that's where we need to challenge ourselves and each other to just do the one thing. We're not going to solve this overnight, but if we're all doing our one thing, then we can get there.
Exactly. Good points.
Right. Hey, Tabitha, in the time we have remaining, I want to make sure that anyone else that's participating here gets a chance to ask Barbara or yourself anything else that we haven't touched on that they've been very interested in knowing related to mental health and mental health awareness. So I know there's some questions out there, but I'll just let audience members either retype those in or go ahead, feel free to vocally ask a question of Barb or Tabitha at this time.
I have a question I'd like to ask. First of all, thank you so much, you guys. My brain feels so stretched in all of this. Oh, I'm loving it. In fact, I got some creative juices flowing on the other sticky note that I have here. So my name is Kenita Scripsma, and I'm the founder and CEO of SEMA Global Consulting, which is an organization that helps promote inclusion. And I'm also part of this group of amazing people at Systemic Diversity and Inclusion Group. So my question to you guys is this. A friend of mine who's a therapist had said this: This pandemic and subsequent quarantine qualifies as trauma. If we lift the quarantine too soon and then have another quarantine in the fall, that would be complex trauma. How would you all suggest people prepare to deal with yet a complex trauma given, these few months that we have ahead of us? In Michigan, at least, we're in yet another closure, I think our third or fourth, I can't remember, I've lost track. So how would you encourage those that are listening to kind of avoid any kind of complex trauma adding to what they're already going through, even though that's what the situation is outside of us? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Barb, did you want to?
I absolutely agree that what we're experiencing is trauma. And when I talk about ACEs, I think of that too, that we're in the process of an adverse experience. So nobody in Ottawa County can any more claim that they've never had an adverse experience. I think it's all of those things that we just encourage for mental health. It's, watching, getting some exercise and fresh air and watching your diet and spending time, whether it's meditating or serving or however you take care of your health. I think it's bringing that awareness, just recognizing what a strain this is on your emotional and mental well-being, and taking that seriously, and shoring up the resources that feed you.
Mm-hmm. I would say, as a person who's experienced multiple trauma, one and then another within a short amount of time, just like we were talking about earlier, what can you control, and focusing on what you can control instead of all the what ifs. We all know that fear, the false evidence appearing real, is so true. It is so true for us, and that we act like it's happening. And so to understand that, do what you can, and all those other things, the reality is that they probably aren't going to happen. And if they are, you'll deal with them when you have to deal with them. And the other thing, like you said, I think getting outside, breathing, or finding a mantra, or finding something that makes you happy, whatever that is, just taking the moment to stop and redirect your focus on something that gives you joy. Those things sustain you through those difficult, traumatic times. No matter how traumatic, you can always go inward and focus on what's inside and what's your truth. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I like to, in keeping with what you were saying, Tabitha, I like the expression that it doesn't help any of us to borrow trouble from the future.
I say that all the time.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you both say, thank you for your answers. And so what I'm hearing actually jump out of what you're saying is basically double down on your efforts for staying mentally healthy and strong. And, because I guess I'm kind of also talking to the person who's already really, really struggling. And so how do they double down, right?
Yeah. And I think it's so keeping your expectations in check too.
Mm-hmm.
But and the doubling down can be, I'm doing teletherapy 4 times a week right now. I mean, it's reaching out for the help that we need, and letting go of any kind of thought that, maybe I should be doing this on my own. Maybe, that getting rid of that, that shame-based and that stigma-based barrier that keeps us from saying, I need somebody to help me right now.
Right. I like to talk about creating a success plan. Again, it goes back to what you can control and what works for you. So my students, if I can talk them through that, then it brings them back to a reality that's not so irrational, illogical, and consuming. And that works.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like
That's
that.
great. Thank you.
So do we have anyone else in the audience want to ask any questions of Barbara or Tabitha? Or even if it's not a question, comments, or even a story to enlighten us on some of your own experiences.
Be good.
David, we also have some people like Margaret, like Tonya, Louis, and okay, no, it seems like they are muted. Because otherwise, I think looking at what they're putting on the board, I think they have very interesting points.
So, good afternoon. This has been a very insightful and very timely conversation, and I was, in the course of the conversation, dropping questions, and I think most of them, I think, have been touched on or answered, but we'll just kind of unpack a little bit more to get your thoughts. And so, very early on in the conversation, I wanted to get some further insight into how do we. So, for those who prescribe to a spiritual practice of any sort, how do we, because this is a layered space right now that we're all operating in. How do we better bridge psychology with theology? What are some various ways in which we can potentially work with church leaders, with pastors, deacons, folks that are in clergy, to again kind of destigmatize and further normalize the mental aspect of who we are, and the spiritual part of who we are. So I was just curious to know, kind of based upon your own background and experience, what have you found has been helpful to either initiate the conversation with clergy, and what are ways in which we can really better normalize us being human, being spirit beings, being emotional beings, and living in a physical world.
May I take that one, Barb? My master's is in religious education, and I work at a religious university. So, and then myself, my own personal story, had it not been for my faith, I would not have made it through. I'm an obstinate, stubborn girl, and I feel like counselors didn't really know what it was like to go through the trauma I went through. So I took the hard journey of no medication, no counseling, or very little of it, and really trying to take this spiritual journey to figure out how that works out, where that conflict is and how to find reconciliation there. But when we talk about, so I had post-traumatic stress disorder, I had anxiety in the heavens, I had depression that was debilitating. So I speak from my heart. And when I speak to clergy and theologians, they're really funny in how they are the ones who say, well, pull up your bootstraps, take it to Jesus and we'll pray for you. And when you get better, you come back. There is a very strong component within the faiths that say, we don't want to talk about this. We don't really want to do anything with it because that's between you and Jesus, or you and your God or your small group. But I think that it's in the moments of actually using that small group or having your leadership talk about it, like Barb was saying, it's just start having the conversation out loud and making sure theologians and preachers are bringing it up, and then bringing it up in the small group, and then finding scriptures or finding things, wise sayings, even if it's just wise sayings, just things that the scriptures have addressed. Is that helpful? Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yes, definitely, because and I can speak as a Black male, obviously, the kind of looking at the Black church, and I know that in different cultures, but kind of coming from a standpoint of the stigma around, or the challenges of just kind of focusing in, and this is my own experience, right? So I'm actually a PK. My parents are ministers, pastors, so I get it. And so the focus tended to be, let's just pray about it. You know, Jesus can answer our, and yes, he can do that, but there's this whole other ecosystem, a very practical professional side of the therapy side of it. So yes, get the spiritual piece down and solid, absolutely. But then but it's also a matter of taking that pivot into, okay, who are the best professional counselors who, if let's say you are a Christian, yes, let's consider looking for a Christian counselor, right?
Yes.
So it's very nuanced, and I think it's important to unpack that whole dynamic, you know, to better destigmatize, you know, and just to say, okay, yes, Jesus is real if you're a Christian, and he can supply all your needs, yes. But there's also this other piece. God gives us also wisdom and you know, wisdom to navigate life, and people who are armed and equipped to also help you unpack issues and traumas and such. So I think, you know, really kind of trying to drive that narrative is so key to the healing that we all seek.
Right.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to also add to that, that I think part of what we're fighting against is really a very long historical view of mental illness, which began as kind of a symbol of, you know, the sign of demon possession, and then ended up being thought of as just, you know, the sign of an immoral life. I mean, we've had all these judgments around mental illness that are pretty religious based, and so that's a lot to overcome. But I do think that, and I was going to mention churches earlier, I don't know how I didn't, but when we were talking about employers and those places where people are gathering, our churches, our synagogues, our temples, those are also places where we need to really be advocating for these kind of conversations. It's true, we have, I know somebody personally who's a severe schizophrenic whose mother was just not going to get him treated because she was waiting for Jesus to heal him. And eventually, through a lot of conversations and interactions, she's now a huge advocate for the medication that he's on, but it's relational. You know, it comes back to the relational piece. And so the more we can have those conversations with people within, and I'm an ordained interfaith minister, we, you know, respecting the religious framework and recognizing the need to bring healing to you know, the same kind of you know, the shame-based, right? That, you know, somehow I'm not living a good enough life or I wouldn't be struggling. That both the members of those congregations and often the leaders of those faith communities need to be engaged in a more empathetic conversation about what mental health and mental illness really is, and how little it is affected by one's life choices.
Right. Yeah. Like the Black church, there are a lot of Black churches that, because of poverty, that plays into it. We didn't talk a lot about that, but it falls to me, the church needs to really start taking up the topic and start addressing real hard issues and start guiding the congregations. They really need to start doing that. And so that's going to take people starting to have to go to their congregation and say, hey, we need to talk.
Yep.
We need to talk about this. Because it's happening in small groups. But nobody is like the whole congregation needs to stand up and say, we want to hear guidance on this and make it happen. And that takes a lot of courage.
Yeah.
All right. Well, sadly, we've come to the end of our time frame that we like to keep to. But what we sure would love to listen to Tabitha and Barb all day long. I'm sure we could, but only for a few more minutes. If Tabitha, I'll let you go first, then we'll end with Barb, some final thoughts on this session and what we can do to each become advocates for the mental health community ourselves.
Oh, my final thought?
Yes.
Oh, all right. I really want this group, I hope that they understand that there is it's intertwined. Mental illness and disability are intertwined. The American Disability Act and laws throughout the world give rights because it's a human condition. And so one thing that you can do, one takeaway for you, is to find out about what's happening in your world, what you can do, what rights are there, so that you become the resource for that individual that comes to you and you hear that there's an issue with mental illness or mental impairments or a struggle that you can help with, to give them the rights for learning and work. I think that that's a critical takeaway for you today, as well as to start having the conversation in your home and in your churches and in your workplaces.
Thank you.
Yeah, my final thoughts are similar. Number one, if you are struggling yourself right now, please reach out. There are people, there are resources. They want to help, they want to assist. Second, if you know somebody who's struggling, take time to listen non-judgmentally. You don't need to have answers. You just need to be willing to sit with people while they hurt. And third, be an advocate. Be an advocate for those who don't have a voice, who are not able to advocate for themselves. And the first way you can do that is by encouraging these conversations. Again, with your family, with your loved ones, in your workplace, in your place of worship, in your bowling league, wherever you are with other people. Start talking about your own mental health as part of your normal conversation, and that'll encourage others to as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we couldn't have asked for two better guests on this topic today than you two, and we appreciate it so very much. And Joseph, I'll give you the last word as we close this out, but my heartfelt thanks to both of you before we leave.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Yes, thank you. I had a great time.
Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you particularly to Barbara. It has been wonderful to hear you. The way you sort of discussed it and focused on the need that we as individuals have to figure out what we can do, and also connected it to others, because all these issues, when we talk about issues of diversity, there are so many, and there are so many we can never even touch because we are not even exposed to them. So we only touch those little ones we know. Again, all I urge everyone is to continue on engagement, because through engagement opens the window to see, not just from your window or vantage standpoint, but to see from multiple standpoints. And the only thing we can learn comes from opening up from point of views that we hadn't known. We all have already formulated our views. We know what we know. And the only way to get new things is those we have never been exposed to.